Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. And today we are going to talk about the differences between battle maps and minis versus theater of the mind. Now, these are two styles of play, and they're not the only two, though they tend to be kind of the two primary categories of how you're going to play a role-playing game. Basically, what it comes down to is, are you going to have a map when it gets time for fighting, when it's combat time? Are you going to use a map with miniatures or tokens or something to represent locations? Or are you going to just imagine it all in your head? There's a lot of different ways to do maps. I don't even remember where I got this. I've had it forever. There are pre-printed kind of dungeon maps that you can use. There are, minis that you can have that you set out. You can have actual big terrain pieces if you want to use those. Or you can just go really light with, say, a dry erase board and a marker that has a grid pre-printed on it, and then you just go through, and every time there's a fight you mark out, well, here's what the tavern looks like, and here's some, that sort of thing. And then you could use minis, or you could use slips of paper, you could use little tokens or markers, however you want to represent the battle. And the reason for doing this, there's two main reasons that you would want to, I think, do this. First of all, it looks really good, especially if you have, fancy painted terrain that you could actually lay out there and really good minis. And there's a lot of different ways to get this. You can buy pre-painted minis, and there's a lot of companies that sell those. You could buy, just any old miniatures and paint them yourself. And so the fancier you're able to get it to look, the cooler it looks. And then your players show up to play, and you're like, it is time for a battle. You're in a dungeon. Boom! And then you put it out on the table, or you have it already laid out on the table. And here's this incredible dungeon where they can literally move through it and open doors and explore things. Or maybe you've got a big village laid out, and they're going to have a fight in a village or something like that. There's a lot to be said for that kind of verisimilitude. The chance to see things presented in front of you can just add a lot of atmosphere to the game, and so it's really valuable for that sense. The other reason that I think, one of the main reasons that I think that this is, that using battle maps and minis is good, is because, especially for something like D&D or Pathfinder, the games kind of are designed around it. In fact, a lot of games literally just use inches for movement. If you're playing, Iron Kingdoms, then every 5 feet is an inch or something like that, and your spells and your movement all just have inch ranges because they assume that you're going to be using a table with some minis on it. And so using a system like that relies on very minute measurements and very specific placement of things is what makes a lot of those systems combat work on, firing on all cylinders. You can absolutely play D&D without that, but once you add that in, suddenly little things like taking a 5-foot step or knowing exactly who is engaged with who, and figuring out your lines of sight, using the terrain to your advantage. Mechanically, using a battle map can add a lot of extra tactics and extra value from a mechanical standpoint. So it looks really good, and it makes the game run smoother. Those are the two things in my favor, or let's see, those are the two things in my opinion that work in favor of battle maps and minis. On the other hand, the alternate style of play is what we call theater of the mind. Theater of the mind is the very highfalutin name for we're just going to pretend. And that's where you ask people to imagine it in their heads. And you can get very verbose if you want, and you can describe, you go into the tavern, and there's tables here, and there's booths against the wall, and there's a big bar, and there's glass all over. There's a huge chandelier in the middle. And then as you are describing all of this stuff, the players don't have to have it laid out in front of them. They can just imagine in their head. And often this requires a little more communication and a little more fudging of things. That if they say, who's the closest enemy to me? And you're like, well, it's the orc with the red hat. And then they go, okay, well, I'm going to attack him. Or you can say, can I get away? Can I just run and flee this fight? And then you say, well, you could, but there's an orc standing in between you and the door. And so you need to be a little more willing to answer questions, and often you need to be more willing to fudge things if you need to. If you really want them to be stuck there, you can just describe a hallway as being too narrow to get through, whereas if you were on a map, you would just kind of be stuck with whatever map you need. So there's a chance with Theater of the Mind to tweak things more fully. Now, I suspect that even people who rely very heavily on battle maps and minis don't use them for every single combat that they come across. I've talked about the encounter balance of D&D 5 before. It assumes you're going to have a lot of fights. And unless you're using, a pre-built campaign supplement that has the whole dungeon already mapped out, you don't necessarily have the terrain and the minis for every single fight. Sometimes the characters just pick a fight in an alley, or they have a random encounter in the wilderness that you don't necessarily have prepared for. You just know, okay, we're going to do this one Theater of the Mind because I don't have the stuff close at hand for it. So I think a lot of campaigns end up being a hybrid. They will use the battle maps and the minis for the big fights, for the showpieces, for the climaxes. But little things that crop up here and there are just like, well, no, you got jumped on the road. I'm not going to draw a road for you. Just fight. And so a lot of people are more accustomed to Theater of the Mind than they might think they are because they've probably done quite a few encounters in that system. Now, all of this is complicated by the fact that during these pandemic times, a lot of the gaming you might be doing is probably online. If you have been following good COVID safety procedures, you're probably not going to a game store every Saturday night and meeting a bunch of strangers and sitting around a table and playing with them. And so a lot of our gaming has moved online. The good news is there are a lot of websites that still allow this. I use Roll20 all the time, which is a really nice way of using the battle map system, but giving everybody access to it. And it's a system that's designed for you to be able to, put up a battle map and show it to people, and then they can all move their own tokens around. And a lot of these, like Roll20 and I think Fantasy Grounds and things like that, have dynamic lighting rules already set up where you can give them the whole map, but they can only see the part that their token can see. And these are some really slick systems. I love the way that Roll20 uses them. But Roll20, Fantasy Grounds, and there's a bunch. If you look up tabletop simulators or something like that on Google, you're going to find a lot of different options for these. Something like Roll20 is really valuable to me because most of the battle map gaming that I do is in D&D system, and D&D is like really well partnered with Roll20, so whatever campaign supplement you want to run, they probably already have it there, and you can spend $25 or $30 buy the Roll20 version of that, which comes with all the maps and all the tokens already built with the lighting set up and everything, so that all you have to do is load people into the map and you're ready to go. Now, they've got that with some of the Pathfinder adventure paths. There's a lot of homebrew systems, and so there's a lot of good ways that they can that Roll20 does that. So that's what I use. But you can use whatever you want. This is not an ad for Roll20, though it's clearly an endorsement of it. I don't love battle maps for everything. There are some encounters where I find that a battle map just makes it a lot easier to deal with. And I find that especially if I am working on something that is, trying to run players through anything where the terrain really matters, then I find it's a lot easier to be able to point at a map and say, well, move your token. Where are you? You tell me where you are. Okay. Now we are going into initiative rounds, so you can only move your token when it's your turn, and you can only move it as far as you're allowed to move it, and that'll help us know exactly where everything is. That does occasionally happen. For the most part, though, I find that I prefer this kind of theater of the mind idea, because I am not as interested in the very small, granular specificity of, you're exactly 20 feet away from this monster. The freedom of being able to just say, you come out of the trees into a clearing. There's a giant, evil-looking grove in the middle. You can see large, sinister eyes staring out of it. And, the terrain between you and it is kind of swampy and marshy, and it'll maybe be a little difficult to walk through. You could absolutely sketch that out or build that online, and there's some good systems. I use one called Incarnate that works really well to very quickly create really good-looking digital battle maps that you could use with Roll20. But it's so easy also to just ask people to describe it and then roll with the punches as you go through. And someone tries to charge across and say, how close am I to that grove of trees? And I'll say, well, you're 100 feet away. And that marshy ground is going to be half movement for most of it. And so they'll say, well, okay, then I can't move very close, so I'm going to need to come up with something else. And it makes the story a little less like a miniatures game and more like a storytelling game, which personally I prefer. But every group is different, and I'm absolutely not looking down on anyone who uses maps and minis, because I use maps and minis all the time. What you really need to think about when you are making this choice, there's, I guess, two main things. Number one, am I going to get meaningful value from the maps and minis? Which basically means if the look of it is worth it to you, and if that specificity is worth it to you, then you might really want the maps and minis. They will bring value to your game. The other consideration is, do I have the time for this? And not everybody does. I remember back, 10 years ago when I was in a D&D group in my old house, 2 houses ago. Our DM for that, he had this huge kind of roll-out rubber mat that was dry erase, and it had a grid on it. And when we get into a fight, he would have his little graph paper, and then he would sketch it out with markers so that we could see, the castle or the cave system or whatever it was that we were exploring. And the problem with that is that he had to spend all that time to come up with the very specific map. And then he had to spend more time, sometimes during the session, to sketch it onto our big, huge map. And it was relatively cheap because it was just a rubber mat with some Sharpies, or not Sharpies, dry erase markers. And maybe if we'd been willing to invest more money, which none of us had at the time, we could have had a faster system that would allow him to pre-build the maps because we could have afforded more than one rubber mat, so we wouldn't have to pause. He could take them home, draw the maps, and then bring them to the class or to the game. There's a lot of different considerations here. But I guess when I said time, money's a big part too. Do you have the time and the money to invest in a good map system? Sometimes you can find these, and I know that older versions of D&D have published modular little kind of paper cardboard mat systems. And I know a lot of people still produce those. And so if you want a really cheap option, that is one that looks nice. If you are willing to spend more money, there are so many people who are selling, you know, fully modular dungeon systems that you can set up, and, you know, pre-painted minis and all of this extra stuff. But the core comes down to you as a GM. Do you have the money for that kind of thing? Do you have the time to put into pre-building that whole world, that setting, that scenario, that location? And then the first question, is it going to add something meaningful? And I think that if you are playing something like D&D and Pathfinder, the answer might end up being, yeah, it does. It helps us play the game better. It looks really good. We're going to go for it. If you are playing something like Mutants and Masterminds, for which people don't really produce a lot of, you know, modern world terrain. So if you're playing a modern Supers game, yeah, maybe you could use some old HeroClix guys and just lay out a really basic fight. Maybe you want to, you know, invest in something larger than that. It all comes down to what you're playing, what your players expect, and then asking yourself those questions. So let me repeat them again. Do I have the money and the time to invest in this? Is it going to look good enough to be worth it? Is it going to help us play the game? Is it going to make combat faster or easier in some way? And if the answer to any of those is a strong enough yes, and none of them is a really hyperbolic no, then yeah, you'll probably want to get some kind of minis system going. But if you're doing a really rules-light system like you know, Tiny D6 or Fate Accelerated, you probably don't need the battle mat. If you're doing something for which people have not really produced a lot of, you know, the minis or the terrain that you need, then maybe that's not it. Maybe people have produced it, you can't afford it, so you're going to stay away from it. You can easily get pretty much any game to run in Theater of the Mind. But you just have to ask yourself these questions and be really honest about the answers that you have for yourself. And obviously some of those answers will play into each other. Maybe you don't have the money to invest in it, and that is going to kind of answer your "it looks really good" question. Because if you're just using, you know, old buttons and nickels and stuff, then it might not look as awesome as you had hoped it would look. And so that answers that other question for you. I have seen online a lot of people, and I think this was in a Pathfinder forum, but it's a thing that comes up a lot, where people will say, if you don't have a map, the game is unplayable. Absolutely not true. I've even seen somebody accuse someone of saying that if a GM doesn't produce a map for a combat, they're being lazy. That's not true either. There are a lot of reasons to try to do a combat that doesn't involve a map. And that might be you don't have the time or the money for it, or it's just a small encounter, or there's a lot of value in asking people to imagine things. But if you've got the kind of players that really, really want a map, especially if they are willing to do some of that investment of time or money, then yeah, it's worth it to fold it into your game as well. And I guess maybe that's a good note to end on, is the principle of the boat, right? What this means is you don't need to own a boat, but it's nice to have a friend with a boat. A boat is something that costs so much money that it is a prohibitive for most people. It's more expensive than the car you already couldn't afford. But if you've got a friend with a boat, you could still go out on the lake every now and then, right? I don't actually have any friends with boats, so I don't know. I never go out on the lake. But the principle stands. A lot of games are boat games, which is my own little internal word for I don't need to own this, I just need a friend who owns this. And that is what a lot of minis and terrain comes down to. And so if someone in your group has access to that, or better yet, if your group as a whole decides you would love to have minis, and they are willing to all pitch in money in order to buy those minis so that the burden isn't all on a single person, then that can be a really great thing. And so talk to your groups and say, how do we want to do this? Do we want to do battle maps, or do we want to do Theater of the Mind? Here are the pros and cons of each. Theater of the Mind is typically much faster. It is gives you the chance to do something a lot more imaginative. You are not restricted by the types of minis or terrain that you own. There's a lot of really great pros to Theater of the Mind. The cons then are things like, well, we have to ask more questions during combat. We don't always know exactly where we can see. We have to ask GM questions instead of making our own decisions because we can't look at the map. Anyway, ask your players what they want. Ask them what they're willing to invest in order to get it, and then roll with it. And you can absolutely make it work online as well as offline. So, there you go. Thank you very much for watching this video. I have a bunch of books that you should read. They're all listed in the info under this video. I've also got a bunch. I am a professional game master, and I can run games for you online. And so if you would like to do that, there's info there as well. My name is Dan Wells, and you are awesome.